We often think of medieval survival as crude, primitive, and desperate. But what if they had systems quiet, patient, forgotten systems that still work better than ours today? No matches, no lighter, no fuel, and yet they kept fire alive. For days, even weeks, using a fungus carved by hand and wrapped in moss. They built ember containers that breathed. They stored heat in clay, and some kept a single ember burning for months. This wasn't luck. It wasn't brute force. It was knowledge passed hand to hand from fire to fire through winters colder than we can imagine. And for one man, a shepherd alone in the mountains, those systems were more than history. They were his last chance. His name was Toma, because when the flames went out, he didn't rebuild fire. He remembered it. The cold didn't ask for permission that year. It arrived early, crept through the hills before the leaves had fallen, and settled in the cracks of Toma's hut, like it belonged there. The woodpile was damp. The goats were restless. Even the fire in the hearth seemed to hesitate before catching. But Toma didn't curse the weather. He knew better. Winter wasn't an enemy. It was a test. He had no firewood to waste. No oil, no tools, no one to call. Just a few worn cloths, a cracked ember container, and the kind of knowledge you don't learn in books. The kind passed down beside the fire, from voices now long silent. He didn't think of himself as clever. He wasn't strong, and he wasn't young. But he was alive. And when you live alone high in the mountains, sometimes survival isn't about strength. It's about memory, and what you do with it when the cold is deeper than silence. The morning light hadn't touched the ridge yet, but inside the hut the cold had already arrived. Toma sat up slowly, hand pressed against the clay walls, still warm. That was a good sign. The ember might still be alive. He reached under the hearthstone and pulled out a bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside, a hardened piece of fungus, dark, round, carved shallow at the center. It didn't look like much, but it held his chance for warmth. Maybe survival. He tapped the center gently with his finger. No smoke, no heat, just silence. Then he leaned close, breathed slowly onto the cavity, and waited. A soft glow stirred beneath the blackened fiber, like the eye of something sleeping, but not gone. Toma cupped his hands, shielding it from the draft, and blew again. The red deepened. He smiled, just a little. His father had taught him this. Not with books, not with tools. Just one ember, one breath, and a warning. Don't ever count on fire to come back. Keep it alive, or lose it. Modern people carry lighters, batteries, solar ignition tools. Toma had none of that. But he had memory. And a fungus that grew on birch trees, harvested in autumn, dried for months, then carved by hand. It could burn for weeks, not with flames, but with patience. He placed the ember fungus near his cookpot, fed it dry fibers, watched the heat ripple through the straw. No panic, no rush, just rhythm. Breath warmth, silence breath again. He didn't think of himself as clever. But when your life depends on a smoldering mushroom, you learn to be careful, to be present, to notice the shift in color, the rise of smoke, the smallest sign that heat still lingers. In the modern world, we talk about fire like a tool. To him, it was something closer to a companion, fragile, stubborn, and needing to be tended like a wound or a child. That morning, he didn't build a fire. He didn't start anything. He just kept something going. That should have died in the dark. By mid-morning, the sky had turned pale like bone. Toma stood outside the hut, the cold licking through his cloak. He had to head downhill. The snow melt from yesterday might have fed the creek again, and he needed water. But he couldn't leave the ember behind. Not with the wind picking up and no shelter along the path. He knelt beside the hearth, unwrapped the fungus he'd reawakened that morning. Still warm, still glowing, just barely. From the dry stone ledge outside, he gathered two kinds of moss. One brittle and brown, one damp and springy. He laid out the dry layer first like a nest, placed the ember in the center, then covered it with a soft wrap of moist moss. Finally, he tucked it all inside a perforated metal tin with a bit of cloth. Breathable but sealed. Warm but not suffocating. Years ago, he'd seen a traveling monk do the same. No fire, no match, just a moss bundle in a copper box, warm like a heartbeat. Toma had asked, "How long will it last?" The monk smiled. Longer than most friendships, modern people carry fuel canisters and spark tools with windproof igniters. But moss doesn't need batteries. It needs understanding how wet is too wet, how much air to allow, when to check it, when to leave it alone. He slung the tin into a leather pouch at his waist, checked that it wasn't too tight, then began the slow walk downhill. With every step, the pouch shifted gently against his side. He didn't think of it as carrying fire. He thought of it as carrying a promise that warmth would still be waiting when he came back. Sometimes surviving isn't about finding heat. It's about not letting it slip away. The trail narrowed into a frozen path shaded by bare oaks. Toma moved slowly every step, a quiet negotiation between mud and ice. The wind was sharper now, tugging at his cloak, biting through the seams. He paused at a bend, unslung the pouch from his hip, and opened it. The moss bundle had shifted. The ember might still be breathing, but barely. He needed something better than cloth and hope. Kneeling beside the trail, he pulled a small tin container from his satchel. It wasn't fancy, dented on the side, rust creeping along the bottom seam, but it had layers inside dry ash, a ring of soft bark shavings, a pocket of moss-wrapped ember, then more bark, then crushed charcoal, then a wool plug. Each layer had a job. Ash for insulation, bark for dryness, charcoal to hold heat, wool to block wind without suffocating breath. He slid the ember bundle into place, repacked each layer by memory, closed the lid tight, tied the latch with twine. He'd made this tin 4 winters ago after nearly losing his last ember to a sudden snowstorm. That night, he'd cried not out of fear, but out of frustration. So much work, gone in a gust. Modern hikers have insulated cases, shockproof containers, temperature sensors. Toma had none of that. But he had rhythm. And rhythm he'd learned was better than any tool. Layer after layer in the right order, like a song your hands remember. He wrapped the tin in a strip of wool and tied it to the inside of his belt, low on the body close to the core, where warmth holds longer. As he continued walking, he touched the container now and then, not to check it, just to remind himself it was still there. Sometimes keeping fire isn't about invention, it's about respect. Around midday, the sun broke through the clouds, thin and pale, but enough to melt the frost off the rocks. Toma found a resting spot under a twisted pine, its roots pushing up from the earth like old knuckles. He unfastened the tin from his belt and set it in his lap. No rush, just routine. He opened the lid. The inner wool was warm, the ember faint, still alive but barely breathing, the kind of silence that hides just beneath the surface. He leaned closer, inhaled, then exhaled slow and even into the layered nest. The wool pulsed, the bark shifted. A thread of orange blinked in the middle like a memory trying to return. He gave it another breath. And another. The glow deepened. Not fire, just certainty. His grandfather used to say, "You don't fight the ember, you talk to it." A breath at the right time is worth more than a pile of wood too late. Modern people often wait until something dies before they act. A phone, a heater, a relationship. Toma had learned to listen for the fade, not when it's gone, but when it starts slipping. He repacked the layers gently, closed the lid without a sound, then leaned back against the pine, eyes closed, and let the silence fill in around him. Sometimes survival isn't loud. It doesn't shout. It waits. And it tests whether you're willing to show up not just once, but again. And again, until the glow returns. By late afternoon, the sky had turned to lead. Clouds moved low and slow, dragging their bellies across the treetops. Toma felt the shift before the first drop fell. The kind of cold that didn't cut, just settled in your bones and stayed. Rain was coming. Not a storm, just the kind of slow, steady drizzle that soaked everything without trying. He looked around. No shelter, no overhang. Just a shallow stone pit where a fire once burned. He dropped to his knees and cleared the pit hands, moving fast, but careful. At the bottom, a bed of old ash, dry gray powdery. Exactly what he needed. He reached for his ember tin, unwrapped it layer by layer. Still warm, still holding on. He scooped out a shallow hole in the center of the ash, then placed the ember inside, covering it gently first, with ash, then with bark. The ember disappeared beneath the gray dust. It didn't go out. It went to sleep. His uncle had taught him that trick long ago, one rainy spring. When the world gets wet, the old man said, bury the fire like a secret, let the ashes guard it, and tomorrow, ask for it back. Modern gear comes with waterproof seals, high-tech insulation emergency packs. But sometimes the most reliable shield is something already burnt. Ash is dry, porous, and willing to protect what it used to be. Toma stayed crouched beside the pit for a while, watching the rain dot the edge of his cloak. The ember was gone now, out of sight, but he didn't feel panic, just a quiet kind of trust. He stood, tightened his belt, and moved on. Not fast, not slow, just steady. The rain fell, the earth darkened, and somewhere beneath that pile of forgotten ash, a tiny ember waited, not to burn, just to survive. By late afternoon, the light was fading not just from the sky, but from everything around him. The trees were darker, the path narrower, the kind of dimness that didn't mean night, yet just that night was coming. Toma sat on a flat stone, opened his satchel, and laid everything out in rows. 3 pieces of fungus, 3 stages of readiness, 1 glowing, 1 dried, 1 still raw, wrapped in linen and pine oil. He didn't look at them like tools. He looked at them like lifelines. Each had a job. If the ember he buried failed, he'd use the second one already treated and sun-dried. If that failed, the third could be prepared over fire tomorrow. And if everything else failed, he'd have no one to blame but himself. He checked them, gently tapping the edges, brushing off moisture, made sure the linen was dry, the oil hadn't soaked through, then rewrapped them in layers of cloth and stored them in separate pouches in case one got wet. His mother used to say, never carry just 1 ember. Even fire can lose its way. Modern people carry backups, 2 extra batteries, dual SIM cards, emergency kits. But too often the backups are just copies of the same thing. Toma's were different, each one at a different point in the cycle. 1 burning, 1 waiting, 1 just beginning. That was the lesson. Don't count on 1 moment of success. Prepare for the failure before it happens. He tied his satchel shut and stood up. The wind had picked up again, brushing against his neck like a warning. But Toma didn't rush. He didn't feel rushed. He felt ready. And sometimes that's all survival really is, not being fast, not being fearless, just being prepared when the fire you depend on decides to vanish. Night had fully arrived. Not loud or sudden, just complete. The kind of darkness that didn't blink. The kind that knew how to wait. Inside the hut, Toma moved slowly. He didn't have much, but he had what he needed. In the corner near the hearth, a small clay jar. No glaze, no decoration, just thick, hand-shaped walls. He opened it, scooped out the old ash inside, then packed the base with dry sand and 2 coals. On top, a folded linen cloth. Then the ember, his last one tonight, cradled in dry moss, wrapped in birch bark. He covered it all with another thin layer of ash. Then set the lid on, gently leaving just enough space to breathe. The monks used to call it the sleeping fire, a way to keep the ember alive without feeding it, without tending it, without watching it all night. He'd seen it once in an abbey kitchen, a dusty jar on a stone shelf, still warm in the morning. No one talked about it, but someone always checked it. Modern homes have thermostats, timers, automation, things that work until they don't. It was simple, quiet, and stubbornly alive. Toma placed the jar near the hearth under a wool cloth. He didn't pray, but he did pause, long enough to recognize what it meant that some things don't burn brighter, they just last longer. He lay down still in his clothes boots near the wall cloak, drawn tight. The fire was gone, but the ember buried in silence would keep breathing. Sometimes survival isn't about pushing through. It's about slowing down long enough to keep something alive, even if that something is just a spark waiting for morning. By morning, the frost had settled, thin, white, silent, like nothing had ever burned at all. But inside the clay jar, the ember still breathed. Faint, steady, enough. Toma didn't smile. He just nodded like someone who remembered something others had forgotten. He hadn't used a match. No lighter, no fuel, just memory. 7 techniques. None of them fast. None of them easy, but they worked because they weren't built for comfort. They were built for survival, and in a world where the wind didn't care where the nights came early and the wood was always wet, that made all the difference. Toma didn't survive because he was strong. He survived because he prepared, because he remembered what others let go, because someone somewhere once showed him how, and because he kept the ember alive not just in the jar, but in himself. We talk about survival like it's a matter of gear. Sometimes it's just a matter of rhythm and respect. If even one of these techniques lit something in you, don't let it fade. Practice it, pass it on, because the next cold might not wait. And when the lights go out, you'll need more than electricity. You'll need memory and the will to keep it burning.